A Harvard professor called the fracture a mystery, but a janitor's daughter saw a pattern, not with numbers, but with silence. At exactly 5:35 a.m., when the corridors of Harvard's applied physics laboratory were still steeped in pre-dawn stillness, a small girl moved softly through the hallway. She carried a spray bottle in one hand and a cloth in the other. Her name was Emily Ray. 12 years old, daughter of Linda Ray, a custodian from the Appalachian Hills who often said, "Every layer of dust holds a whisper from the past." They lived in a cramped attic above a laundromat in Cambridge. The floorboards creaked with stories. The single window was warped, casting sunlight into strange shapes that danced along the wooden floor like memories trying to take form. Emily woke up before dawn, not because she had to help her mother clean, but because she loved the silence of marble corridors, the untouched chalk dust on old blackboards, the way this world felt still, as if waiting for someone to notice. 2 years ago, her father, a coal miner in West Virginia, died in a tunnel collapse. Since then, Linda packed what little they had, took Emily by the hand, and moved north. She took the first job she could find at the university, sweeping floors and wiping boards, anything to build a life where Emily might someday enter a classroom not as a cleaner's child, but as a student. Emily rarely spoke of her father, but every night she left a space open beside the window, a tiny gap, as if waiting for the beam of a miner's truck that once rumbled down the mountain road after dark. That morning, in Lab Room 203, Emily paused mid-clean. There was a crack on the glass. Not fresh, not jagged. It stretched wide, forking, branching, bending like tree roots beneath dry soil. She didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a tattered notebook, and began to draw. Not with rulers or protractors, just her eyes. Her hands. Hands used to tracing the hems of her mother's work uniforms, the way her grandmother once taught her to stitch without a pattern, only with feeling. Each branch of the crack bent unpredictably. Some curled inwards, some split, some halted. It reminded Emily of knitting with her grandmother back in Kentucky, how each loop had a reason, even if it didn't make sense yet. The lines on the glass weren't random. They moved like thought. Emily didn't know, not yet, that what she was sketching mirrored a long unsolved problem in solid-state physics. Stress propagation in non-homogeneous media. In simple terms, it was the mystery of how pressure travels through irregular material. A field filled with equations, chaos, assumptions, and no true map. But that morning, a 12-year-old girl drew a map, a first draft, not with theory, not with proof, but with listening. Her mother, Linda, called softly from the hallway, "Sweetie, next room's ready." Emily folded her notebook quickly. "Coming." As they moved to the next classroom, Emily kept glancing at the window. Something inside her had stirred. Not just curiosity, something deeper. A familiarity, like the crack had spoken. That evening, they returned to their small attic, the scent of soap and old paper clinging to their clothes. Linda reheated leftover lentil soup while Emily sat by the window, sketching the crack again from memory. This time she added tiny arrows, notations of movement. She circled where the crack slowed, split, or simply stopped. "What are you drawing, honey?" her mother asked, placing 2 bowls on the table. "Just something from the lab." Linda glanced at the page. "That's a broken window?" Emily nodded. Linda looked closer. "Looks like a root system. Or veins." Emily smiled faintly. "Or maybe lightning." They ate in silence, but Linda's eyes lingered on her daughter. She was always quiet, always observant. But lately there was something new, a kind of focus that seemed to light her from inside. That night, as the city murmured beneath their window, Emily opened her notebook again. She wrote in the top margin, "Why do some lines split and others stop?" Across campus, in an office lined with chalkboards and old conference posters, Professor Charles Whitman reviewed the results of his latest stress tests. He was frustrated. His models predicted one pattern. The glass followed another. Too many variables. Too much noise. Nothing matched. He tossed the latest printout into a drawer, rubbed his eyes, and muttered, "We're not seeing it right." But Emily had seen something. Not in numbers, but in rhythm. In form. Over the next 3 mornings, Emily visited room 203 again. The crack hadn't changed, but she noticed new things. One line had a smaller branch near the edge. She hadn't seen that before. Another seemed to shimmer differently depending on the light. She began drawing not just the crack, but the space around it, the silence it created, the tension. On the 4th morning, she slipped a piece of tracing paper over the glass and sketched quietly. But as she finished, she heard footsteps, sharp, adult, purposeful. She froze. The door creaked. "Hello?" a voice called. Emily dropped the paper and ducked behind the desk. The door opened. A man in a tweed coat entered. Whitman. He glanced around, confused, then noticed the sheet of tracing paper on the window ledge. He picked it up. Lines, arrows, arcs. It was the crack, but not just as damage. It was described, understood, interpreted. He frowned. Who had drawn this? He checked the hallway. No one. Emily held her breath, heart racing. Then, slowly, Whitman placed the paper back and walked out, closing the door gently behind him. Emily didn't move for a full minute. When she emerged, she didn't take the paper. She just stared at it. He hadn't erased it. Back at home that evening, Emily drew it all again. This time she added not just arrows, but symbols, a spiral for tension, a starburst for split, a circle for pause. She whispered to herself, "It's like it's breathing." Linda tucked her in that night, brushing Emily's hair back. "What's got you thinking so deep these days?" "Nothing bad," Emily said. "Just cracks." Her mother chuckled softly. "Well, sometimes that's how the light gets in." Emily didn't reply, but she thought of the glass, of the path, of her father's old boots, scuffed and silent in the corner, of tunnels, of pressure, of brakes. And she thought, maybe not all cracks are endings. Some are just maps no one's learned to read. The morning after her silent encounter with Professor Whitman's footsteps, Emily returned to room 203 earlier than usual. Her hands were still slightly ink-stained, her coat dusted with chalk from the night before. She glanced at the glass. The same old fracture stretched across it. But something felt different now, as if the crack had acknowledged her too. She opened her notebook and flipped back to yesterday's sketch. She ran her fingers along the arrows she'd drawn, tracing their movement like someone retracing a journey. She couldn't explain it, but the lines spoke. Not in words, but in pauses, in sharp turns, in quiet. And what they whispered was not random. Later that morning, while helping her mother in the hallway near the mechanical engineering wing, Emily passed another lab. The sun hit the glass at just the right angle, and she froze. Her breath caught in her throat. There, on a different window, an entirely different building, was another crack. It was almost identical. Same direction of the main fracture. Same curvature on the lower branch. Same sudden halt on the right side. Emily's heart raced. That couldn't be. Cracks don't repeat themselves. Not like that. Her hand instinctively reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the notebook. She flipped to the previous sketch. She held it up against the glass, aligned the angles, checked the intersections. They matched. A chill passed through her. What were the odds? She stared, silent, for what felt like hours. Then she heard footsteps approaching. Heavy, hurried. A voice down the hall. She ducked away quickly, heart pounding. Later that afternoon, unable to stop thinking, she snuck into an unused side room, a disused seminar space off the North Hall, room 108. It had a chalkboard still stained with old lecture notes. The air smelled of forgotten books and dry eraser dust. She closed the door gently. Then she began to draw. Not the cracks this time, but how they moved. She marked angles of departure, lengths of split, thresholds where lines stopped or coiled back inward. She boxed off sections of mirrored behavior. She circled a shared bend between both fractures, what she now called a reflection arc. Her lines curved across the board in strange, fluid grace, more like a conductor's script than math. She whispered to herself, "It's not about the break. It's about how the break travels." Suddenly, the doorknob turned. Emily gasped. A research student, tall, early 20s, arms full of printouts, pushed the door open and froze. Emily was standing in front of a board filled with chalk markings, her sleeves rolled up, hands covered in dust. They locked eyes. He blinked. Is this room being cleaned?" Emily grabbed the chalk, hastily wiped a portion of the board, and nodded nervously. "Just cleaning. I'll be out soon." He glanced at the board, half-erased diagrams, loops, arrows, symbols that didn't belong to any textbook. Then back at her. He hesitated, then said nothing, nodded, and backed out of the room. Emily stood still until the door clicked shut. Her heart thudded. She'd nearly been seen, not just as a cleaner, but as something else, as someone drawing. She turned back to the board. Half her work was gone, but in the center remained one untouched mark, a mirrored curve, circled twice. She looked at it for a long time, then whispered, "You're not just breaking, you're mirroring." That night, in the attic, Emily said nothing during dinner. Linda noticed. "Long day?" Emily just nodded. When the dishes were done, Emily sat by the window and opened her notebook. On the final page, she wrote a sentence in small, careful print. "If cracks repeat themselves, maybe they're not random at all." She stared at the words for a long time. Then, underneath it, she drew the curve again. Not broken, not jagged. This time, she drew it folding inward like a ribbon. Soft, deliberate, almost gentle. She added one word below it. Listening. Professor Charles Whitman did not start his morning with coffee. He started it with numbers. Long columns of data from the stress simulation he had spent 2 years refining. Today, as usual, the numbers betrayed him. He stared at the screen in silence. The models failed again. The stress vectors diverged. The crack paths simulated under controlled pressure no longer matched what was physically happening in the glass tests down the hall. "Why?" he whispered. He was not new to failure. Science often failed. But this was persistent, mocking. Like a rhythm he could hear but couldn't tap into. He stood, crossed the room, and retrieved the latest test results. They'd run another impact simulation on reinforced safety glass. The predicted fracture should have arced right. Instead, it curled inward, split, and stalled. He shuffled through the photos attached to the case file. Close-ups of the glass panels post-stress. The last photo made him pause. At the corner of the frame, barely visible, was a sheet of notebook paper. Not official lab notes. Lined paper, folded, slightly torn. Curious, he zoomed in. It wasn't a report. It was a sketch. He squinted. It looked hand-drawn. Arrows, curves, shapes around a crack. A small spiral in the corner. And most telling of all, the handwriting. Too rounded. Too loose. Too young. A child's handwriting. He blinked. Who left this here? It didn't match any of his graduate assistants. It wasn't in the official logs. He printed the photo, trimmed it, and pinned it beside his desk. Then he ran a software comparison between this fracture photo and the simulation models again. The model failed. Again. But when he overlaid the sketch, that messy, impulsive sketch, onto the crack pattern in the image, something unexpected happened. The paths aligned. Not precisely, not mathematically, but rhythmically. The arcs matched the way the stress seemed to flow. The secondary splits followed predicted trajectories, not from his model, but from the sketch. His heart pounded. Who drew this? He leaned back, staring at the paper. He hadn't felt this way in years, not since his doctoral days. The unease that comes when someone unknown enters a conversation you thought was private. It wasn't just a doodle. It was a map. A map that saw what his equations couldn't. He began retracing the last few days, trying to recall who had access to the lab, who might have been near. Custodians? Interns? He hesitated. Then he remembered the girl. A small girl, no ID badge, who had been in the hallway that morning last week. Dark hoodie, a notebook tucked under her arm. Ray, he muttered. Linda Ray's daughter. He stood abruptly, walked to the hallway and checked the sign-in logs. No students listed. But under building access, room 203, one visitor had logged cleaning duties each morning for the past 8 days. Linda Ray. He returned to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a dusty notebook from a failed sabbatical application. Inside, notes about non-linear fracture mapping. One page labeled, Irregular Fracture Theory, Unsolved Paths. At the bottom, a quote he'd scribbled years ago. When you can't predict the break, look for the echo. He stared at it. Was that what this girl had done? The crack wasn't the answer. It was the echo. That evening, long after the halls had quieted and the classrooms had emptied, Whitman returned to room 203. The window was bathed in dusk light, the old fracture glowing faintly. He approached it slowly. There, faint, was a smudge, the trace of a finger or soft cloth, and in the dust along the sill, a chalk mark. Someone had been here. He sat in the nearest chair and waited. He didn't know what he expected, but as the light dimmed, something became clear to him. This wasn't about discovery anymore. It was about humility. Somewhere a child had seen what he hadn't. He whispered to the glass, "If you're out there, come back." And then he left a note under the window, held down by a piece of chalk. "If you see what I missed, Draw it again. Emily read the note the next morning while her mother wiped down the desks. She didn't touch it. She didn't even look around. But her fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack, where the notebook sat, swollen with sketches and smudged observations. That night, she returned. The campus was quiet, and the air had that kind of late-night chill that made the floor feel colder through her sneakers. Emily slipped through the maintenance door and walked the corridor like a ghost. She knew the guards' rounds. She knew which light flickered by the west stairwell, her cue to wait. Room 203 welcomed her like an old friend. Inside, it smelled faintly of chalk and old radiator heat. She closed the door gently behind her and walked straight to the blackboard. She didn't turn on the lights. Instead, she opened her notebook by the window's glow and tore out 3 pages, the ones she'd copied over and over. She pinned them along the bottom of the board with pieces of chalk. Then she began. Not with numbers, not with variables. She drew arcs, curves that mirrored the stress flows in fractured panes. She added loop points, slow zones, split angles. She marked where 2 fractures had stopped in perfect symmetry, like breath held between 2 people. Each stroke of the chalk was deliberate, fluid. She drew with both hands, often stepping back, then darting forward again like a dancer returning to their mark. She didn't know how long she worked. The air grew colder, her fingers cramped. But she didn't stop. Memories guided her hands. The echo of her father's footsteps on gravel, the gentle pull of her grandmother's voice reading bedtime psalms, the clink of her mother's mop bucket down the halls of empty classrooms. All of it poured into the chalk, into the paths she carved onto the board. Halfway through, she paused. There was a section where none of her previous sketches aligned. The fractures behaved erratically. Nothing looped. Everything darted. She closed her eyes. Then she drew, not what she thought, but what she felt. The shape that emerged wasn't symmetrical. It was rough, like a heart skipping. She circled it, then whispered, "This is where it almost breaks apart." When she finally put the chalk down, the board was full. A complete map of stress behavior, but not in equations, in motion. She had translated chaos into rhythm. Emily stepped back, breathing hard. The board was quiet, not because it was empty, but because it was finished. She stood in the middle of the room and looked around. Not a lab, not a classroom. For that 1 hour, it had become a studio, a chapel, a room that listened. Then she gathered her notebook, her scraps, and left the room exactly as she found it. Except for the board. The next morning at 8:10 a.m., the research committee arrived in room 203 for their scheduled inspection. There had been complaints, faulty equipment, unexpected test failures. The lead researcher, Dr. Helen Price, was first through the door. She froze. "Who?" The others entered behind her. They stared. On the board, arcs, spirals, directional flows. It looked like a mural of motion, a field map of some new language. "Who authorized this?" someone asked. "No name," Price murmured. "No legend, just shapes." One of the younger fellows took a photo. "Wait, some of this looks like Whitman's old fracture data." The room buzzed with half-sentences and murmurs. Was this a prank? Couldn't have been a student. No login data. "We'll check the cameras." Dr. Price stepped closer, fingers hovering near the chalk lines. "These aren't random. They follow pressure arcs. Here, see? This point curves at a natural deceleration. That's not guessing. That's observation." Another professor, Dr. Rosen, leaned in. "And these splits, they mirror. Almost like she, whoever it was, saw the energy folding." By noon, the board had been copied, scanned, and reported. By evening, it had been erased. But not before Whitman saw it. He entered after hours, unlocking the door with a key only he still used. When he saw the board, he stopped breathing. He knew those arcs. He'd failed to plot them for years. Now they danced in front of him, mapped without force, without formula, just presence. Then he saw the note pinned in the corner, written in pencil. It breathes differently at night. He touched the paper with reverence. He sat in the center of the room long after the light dimmed. Just sat, alone with the silence and the last traces of chalk dust. Somewhere out there, a girl had rewritten his question, not as a formula, but as a song. He smiled, a rare, quiet smile. Then whispered, "Let's see if the university knows how to listen." Professor Whitman didn't sleep that night. He lay on his couch, eyes wide open, replaying every curve and angle from the blackboard in room 203. The shapes were vivid behind his eyelids, not just drawings, but echoes of something he once tried to see. By dawn, he was at his office. Dust danced in the first light. He reached for the bottom drawer of his old filing cabinet and opened it with the key he hadn't used in over a decade. Inside were binders and folders labeled with years long past. He pulled out a red-bound thesis, his doctoral dissertation from 31 years ago. Fracture behavior in complex non-isotropic materials. He hadn't opened it since the sabbatical rejection, since he'd decided the question was too unruly, too abstract to chase further. But this morning, he opened to Chapter 7, the final chapter, the one titled Irregular Response Patterns. It was the place where he'd first tried to model fracture not as a clean break, but as a behavior, a motion, a process of becoming. He turned the pages slowly. There, on page 142, was the sketch. Not elegant, not complete, but unmistakable. It was the same mirrored loop Emily had drawn. Whitman exhaled slowly. He pressed his thumb into the page, into the old graphite line, as if trying to wake it up. 31 years ago, he had abandoned this line of inquiry. The math didn't fit. The faculty said it lacked formality. One even laughed and called it artful nonsense. He had believed them. But now, the same shape had reemerged. Not from a model, not from theory, but from a girl with no equations. Just vision. "Is someone," he whispered, "continuing the question I buried?" He stood and paced the room. He remembered how he had once stared at cracks in glass and called them music. He remembered proposing that perhaps stress flowed like water, not force, and being told that physics did not indulge in metaphor. Emily had not used metaphor. She had used chalk. He sat down again and opened another folder, a rejected grant proposal from 1998 titled Visualizing Structural Distress Without Variables. He reread the margins. Looking is not less than solving. His hand trembled. He flipped open his laptop and began typing a memo. Not to the dean, not yet. To himself. Memo. Revisiting abandoned stress path models. Underneath it, he typed, Cross-compare mirrored divergence angles. Room 203 diagrams versus PG 142 thesis. Possible pattern of rotation-based failure echoes. Explore resonant fracture geometry as language, not model. Then he stopped. He looked at the photo he had taken of the blackboard, then at the old sketch in his thesis, then back at the empty whiteboard across from his desk. He walked over and picked up a marker, and for the first time in over a decade, he began to draw. Not formulas, but motion. It was a Thursday evening, quiet and unusually warm for late spring. The corridors of Harvard's physics wing echoed with the faint hum of machines powering down, footsteps of students heading home, and the distant hiss of sprinklers beginning their night rhythm. Emily had finished helping her mother clean early. She carried her notebook and a handful of chalk in her coat pocket. Room 203 had been reassigned. The board had been wiped clean. But Emily found a new place. An old alcove between two lecture halls with a portable blackboard, forgotten but still firm on its rusted wheels. She wheeled it gently into the light of a tall hallway window where the gold dusk filtered through the stained glass. The whole corridor glowed with a yellow hue like honey spilled over stone. Emily opened her notebook and began to draw. She didn't rush. She began with the familiar loops. Arcs that mimicked breath, pressure, collapse. Her hands moved with practiced ease, but her eyes remained fixed. She was watching something she couldn't name, only follow. That was when she heard the footsteps. Slow, heavy, not hurried, not searching, just arriving. She didn't look up at first. Professor Whitman walked quietly down the hallway. He had no plan, only instinct. After days of silent searching and unspoken wonder, he'd followed a glimmer, a rumor from the janitorial staff of a girl drawing again, somewhere near the West Wing. And there she was, small, focused, standing before a board filled with movement. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he stepped into the golden light and sat on the floor, not across, not above, but beside. Emily glanced at him, startled, then uncertain. He gave a small nod. "May I watch?" She hesitated, then nodded slowly. They sat in silence for a few minutes. Then he asked gently, "Why do you draw this?" Emily looked at her chalk-dusted hands, then at the board, then at him. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Because the breaks don't feel random when you follow how they move. It's like they're remembering where they were pushed." Whitman didn't respond right away. He let her words settle. He looked at the shapes she had drawn, curves, spirals, angles that hinted at convergence, divergence, resistance. Then he asked, "Do you know what these are called, mathematically?" She shook her head. "I just name what they do. This one's a curl point. That one I call a drift. Here," she pointed to a spot where two paths bent toward each other, "this one's a return. It's where the break turns back, like it changes its mind." Whitman smiled, not with amusement, but with recognition. He said, "That's almost exactly what we call an inflection junction, but I think I like return better." Emily looked at him, surprised. He asked, "Can I draw something?" She handed him a piece of chalk. He knelt beside her and carefully marked a vector line, a mathematical model overlaying one of her loops. Then he paused, looked at her, and said, "But your version is more accurate." She blinked. "It is?" "Yes," he said, "because you're watching it happen, not forcing it to behave." They drew together, side by side, until the hall dimmed into deeper shadow. They added notations in different symbols, discussed without correcting, listened more than spoke. Eventually, Emily stepped back. She looked at the full board, now alive with converging languages, one from chalk, one from math. She said, "Do you think a break can ever be kind?" Whitman turned to her, and for a long time he didn't answer. Then he said, "Only if someone listens to it." She smiled. Before leaving, Emily took a page from her notebook, drew one of her loops in the corner, and wrote beneath it, "Not a theory, just something I trust." She handed it to him. He folded it carefully, tucked it into his jacket pocket like something sacred. As she wheeled the board back into its corner, he watched her with quiet awe. That night, Whitman wrote in his journal for the first time in 10 years. He described the hallway, the light, the girl, the board, and he ended with this line: "The child does not need teaching. She needs shelter for the question." A week passed. Emily and Whitman continued to meet, always informally, always at the edges of the day, before the halls filled or after they emptied. They never said the word lesson. There was no syllabus. Only the rhythm of chalk, the quiet exchange of observation and instinct. Then one afternoon, Emily handed him a folded paper, thicker than usual. "I tried mapping all the pause points," she said. He opened it carefully. Inside was a web of curves, some sharp, others barely arcing, all interwoven by a common language of motion. At several intersections, she had drawn a soft spiral, not for split or reversal, but for something else. "These are the places where the lines slow down," she explained. "Not stop, just hesitate, like they're catching their breath." He stared at it. His hands trembled. In fracture mechanics, these transitional zones, where stress redistributes rather than releases, were known, theorized, debated. But they were notoriously difficult to predict. The math described them in conditional terms: probabilities, margins of failure. Emily had drawn them. She had not calculated them. She had seen them. Whitman circled one of her symbols. "What do you call this?" "A breath," she said, "because it feels like one." He didn't speak. He couldn't. That night, Whitman took the map home. He scanned it, ran it through his old modeling software, and tried to align her points of pause with the simulated fracture data from previous experiments. They matched. Not perfectly, but consistently. Her map, born of intuition, had found a pattern the algorithms only hinted at. The next morning, he submitted the findings to the university's internal research committee under the heading Preliminary Field Mapping of Dynamic Pause Points in Structural Failure. He included the diagrams. No author listed. 3 days later, he was summoned. "Where did this come from?" asked Dr. Helen Price, the same researcher who had discovered the chalkboard drawings in room 203. "This is extraordinary. But there's no origin, no model, no method." "It's early," Whitman replied. "I wanted feedback before attribution." One committee member frowned. "Is this your work?" Whitman paused. "No," he said. "It's someone I've been learning from." That word, learning, did not sit well with everyone. Price leaned forward. "Charles, if you're mentoring someone, especially someone not enrolled, we need full disclosure. These diagrams don't just imply insight. They challenge existing methods. They're disruptive." Another added, "And if they're uncredited, we can't validate the results. Worse, we can't protect them." "Or you," someone muttered. Whitman stiffened. When he left the meeting, he carried their doubts like weight. The next morning, an email arrived, a formal request to clarify the source of the diagrams. He closed the laptop, then picked up Emily's map. The breaths, the pauses, the unseen music. He whispered, "They're worried I didn't teach her." He smiled. Good. The lecture hall was filled with murmurs and the low rustle of printed agendas. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust in golden shafts. A small stage had been prepared, and at the center stood Whitman's diagrams, the very ones drawn from Emily's breath maps. Emily hadn't meant to be there. She had come with her mother to return a lost library cart. But as they passed the East Lecture Wing, she heard her name, not aloud, not directly, but in the sound of chalk against board. A rhythm she knew, a line that curved like hers. Her mother went on ahead. Emily stayed back. She crept quietly into the corridor where a door had been left slightly ajar. She knelt by the edge, peeking through the gap. Inside, the committee sat in semicircles. Professors, researchers, a few students, and Whitman. He stood at the board, gesturing not with pride, but with care, as if the diagrams were alive. These transitional arcs, he explained, appear consistently in the observed fracture paths, not as failure, but as hesitation, a redistribution of force, not collapse. He pointed to the spirals. We've called them transitional pauses, but the original diagram labeled them differently. There was a beat. No one asked. No one said, "Who labeled them first?" Emily's chest tightened. She watched as Whitman continued. He didn't lie. He didn't claim them. But he didn't name her. As he spoke, the audience scribbled notes, nodded, murmured words like elegant, innovative, and framework. Yet the drawings on the board, those soft spirals, those delicate arcs, had not been born of lab protocol or simulation scripts. They had come from the quiet of an attic, the late hours of a janitor's child, tracing what she sensed but could not name. Emily pressed her hand to the floor, grounding herself. Why does no one wonder who saw it first? She thought. She remembered the night she first called a curve a breath. She remembered sitting cross-legged by the dusty window, drawing with frozen fingers while her mother hummed a lullaby in the kitchen. Those lines on the board weren't theory. They were memory. They were her father's worn gloves, her mother's tired eyes, her own trembling question. Why do things break the way they do? The applause was brief, respectful. Whitman stepped back from the board, offered a nod, and thanked them. Questions were technical, calculated. No one asked about origin. No one asked about Emily. She stood slowly, quietly, and walked away. Her shoes made no sound on the polished marble. Back in the room, Whitman remained after the crowd dispersed. He stood before the board, tracing a line she had once called a return. He whispered, "I'm sorry." But the room only echoed with silence. Later that night, Emily sat on the rooftop of their apartment, her knees hugged to her chest, notebook resting against her legs. The city hummed below, cars like veins, streetlights blinking like uncertain thoughts. She opened to a blank page. She didn't draw. She wrote, "What is the shape of being forgotten?" And beneath that, she added a curve, not a spiral, not a fracture, just a gentle bend. Then she drew a small door at the end of it. "What if this isn't failure?" she wrote. "What if it's the hallway before the next room?" She closed the book. Tears touched her cheeks, but they didn't fall. Not yet. Inside, her mother brewed tea. Linda didn't ask what happened. She saw her daughter's silence and simply laid a folded blanket on the rooftop chair beside her. Emily curled into it an hour later, and for the first time, she didn't think of equations or pressure paths or bending glass. She just listened to the city. And in the hush between sirens and street sounds, she felt something shift. Not rage, not sadness, but the stillness before the answer. It rained softly the next morning. Emily stood by the window of the apartment, a half-filled mug of cocoa in her hand, untouched. She didn't speak. Her eyes drifted over the rooftops, their edges blurred by the mist. In her notebook, the words she wrote the night before echoed like an unanswered letter. What is the shape of being forgotten? At precisely 8:07 a.m., there was a knock on the door. Her mother opened it to reveal Professor Whitman, umbrella folded, coat damp, a folder tucked beneath one arm. He didn't step inside. He only said, "Emily, would you walk with me?" She hesitated, then nodded. They walked in silence, shoes brushing over puddles, the sound of water slapping the pavement. He didn't lead her back to the lecture halls or the grand faculty wings. Instead, they turned toward the oldest corner of the university, a section almost forgotten. An old stone building stood ahead, ivy crawling over its sides like veins through glass. Whitman unlocked the side entrance and they entered. Dust hung in the air, light spilled through stained windows. The air smelled of chalk and forgotten books. "This used to be the material stress lab," he said quietly. "They moved the experiments years ago. No one uses this wing anymore." He led her down a short hallway and stopped before a wooden door with a brass plate that read, "Room 117. He opened it. Inside was a simple classroom. A long blackboard stretched across one wall. No projector, no screens, just chalk, a few stools, and an empty silence. Emily stepped in. She looked around and froze. On the far side of the board, carefully pinned, was one of her old drawings. Not copied. The original. The breath map. The one she thought had been left behind. Whitman spoke softly. "I didn't put your name on the board yesterday," he said. "Not because I wanted credit, but because I didn't think they were ready." Emily didn't answer. He continued. "But this room, this isn't for them. It's for you." He laid the folder gently on the nearest table. Inside were blank sheets, fresh chalk, a sealed pack of markers, and a note. In handwriting not his own. "She sees what equations can't." Emily's lips parted. Her eyes shimmered. "They don't need you to explain," Whitman said. "They want you to continue drawing." She walked slowly to the board. Her fingers trembled as she picked up a stick of chalk. Then, in one sweeping motion, she began to draw. Not to prove, not to be seen, but because she needed to. Whitman sat in the back of the room, quietly, notebook on his knee. He didn't interrupt. Outside, the rain continued to fall. But inside, something new was unfolding. A sanctuary built not from title or theory, but from the quiet trust of being understood. Emily turned and whispered, "I didn't think I'd get a room." Whitman replied, "You didn't. You made one." Days passed in quiet rhythm. The room in the forgotten wing became a refuge, not just for drawing, but for listening. Emily arrived each morning with a thermos of tea and left each evening with ink-stained fingers and chalk dust in her hair. One afternoon, the sky outside turned a deep slate gray. Thunder threatened in the distance. Whitman had stepped out for a department meeting, and Emily sat alone on her usual stool. In front of her stood the long blackboard, now layered with days of diagrams, spirals, breath points, loops that intersected and reversed. She took a fresh sheet of translucent drafting paper and gently pinned it to the center of the board. Her hands moved slowly at first, then faster. Curves emerged, arcs bent inward, then unexpectedly twisted outward, like cracks not breaking but turning back. She drew one long curve and paused. Her breath caught. There, at the convergence point of several stress paths, where the fractures usually ended, she saw something new. The lines didn't stop. They pivoted. Each one curled slightly, almost imperceptibly, and reversed direction. Not collapse, not just equilibrium. Return. Emily stepped back, heart racing. Her fingers trembled as she reached for another marker. She circled the point where they turned, labeled it in small, careful letters. Turning point. She whispered, "They're not just spreading, they're remembering." The door opened quietly behind her. Whitman stepped in, his coat damp from the rain. He paused, seeing her transfixed by the wall. Emily turned. Her eyes shimmered. "I think stress can come back," she said. "Not just break forward, not just leave scars, but return, like the material is healing itself." Whitman walked to the board slowly. He studied the pivoting arcs. "I've never seen this modeled," he murmured. "It wasn't in the math," Emily said. "It was in the shape." They stood together, staring at the pattern. And then Whitman, almost reverently, whispered, "You found the point where breakage hesitates and chooses a new path." She nodded. "It's not just a map of collapse. It's a mirror of resilience." Outside, the rain struck harder now, but inside, the wall stood still, filled with motion. Emily gently taped the final drawing to the center of the blackboard. All the arcs, the breath points, the fault spirals, the loops, now connected to this single new idea. A place where things didn't end. A place where even breakage could turn back. The turning point. She stepped away, letting the silence hold it. And then she smiled. Not with triumph, but with release. Not all discoveries are equations. Some are invitations. She turned to Whitman and said quietly, "It's finished." He nodded. "Or just beginning." She left the room that night without her notebook, but not by mistake. She placed it beneath the drawing inside a folded cloth and pinned a note on the wall. "This is not a solution. This is a place to pause." And beneath that, for anyone still listening. Whitman returned the next morning and found the room unchanged, and yet completely transformed. He didn't add to the wall. He didn't erase it. He simply sat and looked and breathed. The end.